Welcome to the West Bend webinar for February 2020. On this month, we're going to cover OSHA's top 10 violations for general industry and the construction industry for 2019. Now, OSHA runs a July to July fiscal year, so this data is kind of dated already by a few months. They didn't release the top 10 until December, I think it was, of 2019. As I talked in the invite for everybody, it's important to remember that construction is very broad, and when we get to that in just a few slides, you'll see that construction applies to most businesses as well, not just general industry. There are handouts below the chat window. You'll find a PDF. The handouts are there in PDF. The handouts are there in PDF format. I've also included two links that I'll talk about as we get to those particular sections. So general industry. General industry is basically the set of regulations that applies to all businesses in the United States. And this applies to you no matter if you're a one employee sole proprietorship to a multinational corporation. Your US operations are going to be covered by general industry standards. Now, a few states have implemented their own OSHA programs, and I'll talk about that at some webinar in the future. But those states have to adopt standards that are virtually the same or just as protective as the federal standards. And so it's important to realize that the top 10 I'm showing you are federal OSHA's top 10. So they might be slightly different in Minnesota or Iowa or Michigan. Those are states that have their own OSHA programs. But in Iowa, for example, they've adopted all of the OSHA regulations verbatim with the exception of one. Other states, Minnesota has a tendency, and Michigan as well, they have a tendency to write more of their own specific standards. So these are the standards that apply, like I said, to general industry, most businesses, and they even apply to some construction businesses because construction organizations have offices, they may have shops. Those are typically going to be classified under general industry. It's also important to realize that where OSHA has a regulation in the construction industry, such as the hazard communication standard in the construction industry, it actually just references back to the general industry standard. Same thing with respiratory protection, and there's a few others that occurs with as well. So there is overlap in even the standards. So the number one violation in 2019 for general industry was the hazard communication standard. About 7,000 citations across the 27 states that are federal states. The common issues here, and these are in the order of which the violations occurred, were businesses just not having a written hazard communication program. You need to make sure you have a program, and the program covers labeling, safety data sheets, the employee training, how the employee training is going to be accomplished, and all those things. So OSHA is finding that businesses still aren't writing hazard communication programs. And I'd encourage you, it's probably been a number of years, maybe a decade, that you've last looked at your hazard communication program. You should just make sure it's there, people know about it, it has all the parts that are needed in it. You need to make sure that you're ensuring that you're providing employees with training on the hazard communication program. You need to talk to them as part of that training where and how they may be exposed to hazardous chemicals, how they can access your safety data sheets. And you need to make sure you're talking about the specific health and physical hazards of the chemicals they are exposed to. So it's important to make sure your training program is in place and it's covering those things. I will say there is no retraining requirement for the hazard communication standard. I see a lot of businesses do that. The important thing is to realize if you change hazards in your if you change chemicals in your facility and those chemicals have different hazards than you may have trained on before, then you need to make sure you're updating and retraining employees on those new hazards as applicable. You want to make sure that employees can readily access material safety data sheets, or as they're just referred to now, safety data sheets. All shifts, all hours, needs to be ready access. A lot of employers are moving to electronic systems. That's fine. You just need to make sure that employees have access to the computer. I remember one organization had to go into the nurse's office to get access to the safety data sheets. That wasn't a problem other than on second and third shift when there was no nurse. And so employees didn't have access, and that employer got a prompt and hefty fine from OSHA when employees complained. The last thing, as far as the common hazard communication citations go, were with container labeling. You need to make sure you have a container labeling system in place. Typically, as long as you're not defacing or removing the manufacturer's labels, you're good to go. It's where you have secondary containers and they're not putting the name of the material on it. They're not putting the hazardous, the hazard statements, the warning statements in place. So you want to make sure if you're using secondary containers, those are a generic container that you're transferring from a larger container typically into a smaller container. Make sure you have a labeling program in place for those and make sure it's used. The next number 2 violation in general industry was the control of hazardous energy, or the lockout standard. I don't refer to it as tag out. Tag out should be eliminated from your vocabulary, and I have a podcast on that you may want to listen to at some point in time. Common issues with the hazardous energy standard were the fact that OSHA is still finding that there's no energy control procedures for all equipment in place. And it's important to realize you need to have machine-specific procedures unless there's 7 criteria met. So if you have a piece of equipment that doesn't meet all 7 of these criteria, you need a machine-specific lockout procedure in place. So those 7 criteria are a single energy source, no potential for stored or residual energy, the isolation and locking will completely de-energize and deactivate the machine, a single lockout device achieves lockout, the lockout device is under the exclusive control of the employee during work, the servicing or maintenance activity does not create a hazard for other employees, and the 7th criteria is that there have been no accidents involving the unexpected activation or re-energization of the machine or equipment during servicing or maintenance. You think about a garage door, overhead garage door. Do I need a lockout procedure for it if somebody's working on the door? And the answer to that is yes, especially if it has an opener on it. You have the opener as one energy source. You have the torsion spring on most garage doors above them. That torsion spring is a source of stored energy. And so you need to think about things like that. You need to take a careful consideration. Now, OSHA's not coming in and giving you citations for not having a lockout procedure on your overhead doors. What happens is OSHA comes in because of a complaint or an injury or fatality and finds out that, oh, an employee was working on an overhead door. There's about 14 fatalities a year from working on overhead doors. OSHA comes in, looks at that and says, oh, what do you know? You had Fred working on this overhead door and you didn't have a procedure in place, so you promptly get a citation for not having a procedure. The second part is making sure that you've provided your staff with training and ensure they have the knowledge and skills to perform lockout. It's not that you just think they do. It's not that you just assume your maintenance employee has the ability to perform lockout. It's that there is training and that training has been documented. Number 3, another one that I've talked about in a podcast, and I have a link later on, is that you need to perform periodic inspections. And this is one of the most overlooked parts of the lockout standard. Actually, the podcast was released on December 13th, 2019. I talk about the annual periodic inspection requirements, but basically you must review each and every energy control procedure you have on an annual basis to ensure it works. You have to be having an employee utilize the procedure and having another employee follow that employee to ensure that the procedure is being utilized and that the procedure works properly. So basically you have to have 2 people utilizing each procedure, and OSHA has a caveat if you're not using the procedure every year, but it is very time consuming and I rarely see employers doing this properly. The 4th element is that OSHA is just seeing that employers don't have a written lockout program in place, and so you need to make sure you have a written program in place. It talks about the energy control procedures, training, periodic inspections, and specific activities such as shift and personnel changes, group lockout, the use of outside contractors when doing lockout, and how they interface with your own employees. So there's a number of requirements there from a written procedure perspective. And the last part is OSHA wants to make sure that you have proper procedures in place, that your procedures when employees are locking out equipment follow the right steps. The steps being preparing for a lockout, shutting down the equipment, isolating the energy sources, applying the lockout device, controlling the stored energy, verifying lockout, performing the work, then releasing the equipment from lockout. And as I said before, you need to consider that shift changes, outside contractors, group lockout, and those types of things to make sure that all those elements are being met and addressed in your procedures. Respiratory protection overall was the next most common standard violated by OSHA. There were 2,826 citations. The key here is that if you have employees in your facility required to wear respirators, and that includes dust masks, or they're voluntarily wearing respirators, including dust masks, you have certain obligations. Your obligations are going to be dependent upon what you're doing. So if you have employees that are just wearing dust masks and it's voluntary use, there's no requirement that they wear dust masks, but they're choosing to wear them on their own because it's slightly dusty, but it's not more than the permissible exposure limit, then you need to at least be giving the employees a copy of Appendix D of 1910-134. Now, if they're required to wear a respirator, especially a tight fit, if they're required to wear a respirator, you need to make sure that the employee is medically evaluated. If you let employees wear tight-fitting chemical cartridge respirators voluntarily, which I rarely ever see, but even if you allow them to voluntarily wear respirators, they have to go through a medical evaluation process to make sure that they're healthy enough to overcome the physiological demand created by wearing a respirator. I remember early in my career, I was in a facility in Valdosta, Georgia. I was auditing the facility from a corporate perspective, and I noticed that they had about 75 employees that were in the respiratory protection program, but one wasn't medically cleared to wear a respirator, and ironically, it was the only person I saw wearing a respirator in the facility for doing his job. As part of the audit team, I was empowered to pull the employee from the production process and make them immediately go to the company physician for a respiratory physical. And the employer didn't balk. In the course of that physical, and we're talking just hours after I started the audit process, in the course of that physical, the employee was rushed to the hospital because of an emergency heart condition. The doctor indicated to us later on that the physical saved the employee's life because of the demands of wearing a respirator would have likely caused a heart attack later in the day. And that's always stuck with me. I know it was a fluke. I absolutely recognize it was a fluke, but here's a situation where that employee should not have been wearing a respirator, had an underlying medical condition that nobody was really aware of, and somehow he had been missed in the physical process. But we probably saved his life on that particular day. You need to make sure you have a written respiratory protection program in place if you have the use of respirators. The program must cover the selection of respirators, the medical evaluation process, the fit testing requirements, cleaning, disinfecting, storing, inspection, repairing, and maintenance of respirators, the training process, and routine evaluation of your respiratory protection program. As I said before, if you permit the voluntary use of respirators, you still have some obligations. If you only allow the voluntary use of dust masks, filtering face pieces, as OSHA refers to them, you need to make sure employees are provided with a copy of Appendix D. I would have employees sign something saying they received a copy of Appendix D. OSHA doesn't mandate it, but otherwise you have no proof that it was ever done. And if you allow employees to voluntarily wear other forms of respiratory protection, you have the obligation to make sure they're medically cleared, even if it's voluntary, and you still have to have a limited written respiratory protection program. Again, I don't see it often, but occasionally I'll be walking through a maintenance facility where they have a maintenance employee that has a few cans of spray paint and he doesn't like or she doesn't like breathing in the fumes. And I look, and what do you know? There's a filtering cartridge respirator in a bag. Sometimes it's not properly stored, which is a quick $3,000 fine for OSHA if they see it. And then I get to ask a lot of questions about where's your respiratory protection program. The insureds always say, oh, we'll just get rid of the respirator. And so they throw the respirator away. Next time the employee goes to paint, he realizes, oh, I don't have a respirator anymore. He runs to the local Home Depot, Lowe's, Menards store of his choice and grabs another respirator, and you now have another non-compliant situation. So you do have to be diligent about that. And last but not least, not doing fit testing or not doing the right fit test. When employees are required to wear a tight-fitting respirator, no matter if it's positive pressure, negative pressure respirator, you need to make sure that the employees are fit tested, whether qualitatively or quantitatively, and there's different requirements for each and when they're required. You have to make sure they're fit tested, and you have to make sure it's done properly. And so this is a major problem when it comes to respiratory protection. The question was asked in chat about HAZCOM training not required and about lockout tagout, and neither of those two standards require annual training. There's not actually a lot of OSHA standards that require annual training. bloodborne pathogens is one that does off the top of my head. But they do have on lockout tagout, if you find deficiencies in your annual inspection process, you do need to retrain the employee or the employees that are affected by that deficiency. All the standards, more of the modern standards specifically state you don't need to do retraining unless there's deficiencies observed or there's changes in the workplace that render the prior training obsolete. And so just need to be aware of that. A lot of employers simply do retraining every year because they think it's the right thing to do. I have mixed feelings about that, but that's a philosophical discussion. Next citation, most common citations are forklifts. If you have employees driving forklifts, they need to be trained. There's no way around that. You can't assume that they were trained someplace else. I shouldn't say that. If they were trained someplace else, you still have to certify that they are qualified in your facility to operate a forklift. I really wouldn't go down that route. I would make sure you trained them. I have 3 different types of forklift pictures in this slide. You'll see that there's an order picker, stand-up order picker, a traditional sit-down counterbalance lift truck, and then a side load lift truck. And I'll see organizations that provide training, but then they assume that, oh, I trained an employee on how to operate an order picker, they can operate the other 2 types of trucks. And OSHA says no. The training, while there are some parts that are general across all lift trucks, you also need to make sure that the training covers the specifics of the type of lift truck they're driving. You need to make sure that you have a driving evaluation that's specific to the type of lift truck they're driving. So you're doing the training for the truck, the employees, you're making sure you're training them on the specific types. Again, this is another standard that does not require retraining every year. It doesn't even require retraining every 3 years. What OSHA requires is that you need to do a driving evaluation at least once every 3 years. And if the employee passes that evaluation, they don't need to be retrained. If the employee fails that driving evaluation, then they need to be retrained. Or if the employee is observed to operate the vehicle in an unsafe manner, the employee has an accident or a near miss with a fork truck, the employee had a driving evaluation, which they failed, which I talked about, the employee is assigned to drive another type of truck, or there's changes in the workplace that would render the previous training obsolete, then they need to be retrained at that time. So if they're in an accident, they're observed driving unsafely, or they have a driving evaluation that they fail, they have to be retrained. Otherwise, you can train them once. As long as they're a good driver, they continue to be a good driver, they don't have accidents, the workplace doesn't change in such a manner that requires new training, no retraining is required. Next most common element here was that after employees are trained and evaluated on forklift operation, we need to make sure we have proper documentation in place. Certify that the employee was trained, have that driving evaluation, and authorized to operate a powered industrial truck. So you just want to make sure you have a system in place that meets OSHA's requirements to document that the employee is certified. Just participating in the training isn't enough in this case. There needs to be a document trail. 4th most common element of powered industrial truck citations was that when a forklift is found to be in need of repair, it's defective or otherwise unsafe, it must be removed from service. Don't allow that forklift to be operated until it is fixed. And lastly, make sure employees are completing inspections prior to the use of the forklift at least once per shift if the forklift is used across multiple shifts. One of you asked the question about who is a qualified trainer? What do you do to become a qualified trainer? Hang on till about the end of this presentation. When I get into construction industry, I'll talk about what qualified is and how it's up to the employer to define what is qualified to provide certain training or to do certain things. But that's an excellent question. Machine guarding is the 5th most common violation citation issued by OSHA in 2019. About 2,000 citations were issued. Common issues. This one gets to be interesting because there's a lot of overlap. First is making sure that guards are provided where needed and in making sure that they're adequate to protect employees. The second is making sure that there's point of operation guarding in place. A point of operation is the point at which something is done. So let's say you have a piece of metal and it's being bent. Well, the fixture that bends it, that's the point of operation where it contacts the steel to bend it. If you're drilling, the point of operation is a drill bit cutting into the metal. And so point of operation guarding is required, as well as operate other parts of the machine, motors, drive belts, drive shafts, those also need to be guarded. And so it's interesting here that OSHA sees more guarding issues not related to the point of operation than they do see at the point of operation. It was about a 2-to-1 ratio, if I remember right in the statistics. So we need to make sure that where guarding is required, guarding is present. The next one here is that fixed equipment needs to be anchored. This is just an easy one for OSHA to pick up and see violations on. What this means is that OSHA says that anything that's designed for a fixed location must be anchored. The easiest test is if a machine has bolt holes for anchors, for floor anchors, they need to be used. Biggest culprit in this are drill presses, floor mount stand drill presses. They always have bolt holes. They have a narrow base. They need to be anchored to the floor. You're going to have to drill some holes into the floor, put some anchors in. The other one that's commonly missed is pedestal grinders, not bench mounted grinders, but a pedestal grinder. Those need to be anchored to the floor. These are both machines that tend to be top heavy. They get force, can have force applied to them, and they easily fall over. And OSHA can easily walk through your facility and look for things with bolt holes and find that they're not anchored to the floor and give you a citation for that. Guards not being secured was the fourth most common element. So we just need to make sure that the guards are in place and they're secured in a manner that they cannot be readily removed. There is a minor little caveat to this. If the guard can be removed and the machine can't operate, or it doesn't have a wind down period, let's say you have a big flywheel, you pull the guard off and the flywheel's still spinning around, OSHA would give you a citation for that. But if there was some way that the guard couldn't be removed, the guard was interlocked, that it couldn't be removed until the flywheel had stopped moving, OSHA can kind of accept that. As technology advances, OSHA's machine guarding and control regulations have not advanced, and they're looking at rewriting lockout specifically because of that. There's a lot of great control mechanisms out there that would negate the need for some lockout processes. And OSHA struggles with that because of technology, and so they're working on that. And the last one is fan blades less than 7 feet from the working level need to have openings 1/2 inch or less, or no larger than a 1/2 inch. So what OSHA is finding is they're still finding some fans out there that either are missing guards or they have old guards on them. Not a lot of citations on this, but it's still made the top 5 for machine guarding. The link there you see is from a webinar I did last year on machine guarding. So if you want more information on machine guarding, examples of machine guarding, when in the handouts, feel free to click on that link, and we'll start that YouTube video from last year for you. Now we get into the construction industry, 5 most common citations. Remember, construction industry, in OSHA's opinion, is pretty broad-based. Construction regulations apply to any construction activities that your business may be engaged in, and you have more of them than you think. It includes many maintenance activities because OSHA considers constructions, alterations to a building, equipment, machine, repairs to a building, equipment, some equipment, machines, and painting and decorating to be construction-related activities. So if you have an employee climbing on a ladder to paint, you now have to comply with the construction ladder safety requirements, which are slightly different than the general industry ladder safety requirements. So I think most people don't realize that construction industry regulations really apply to them as well. Most common citation in the construction industry, the most common citation across both construction and general industry, was the general fall protection requirements. The 4 most common issues found in the fall protection requirements are all due to employees working 6 feet or more from a lower level and not being protected by fall protection. Whether that's in residential construction, whether that's being just on another work surface, a platform more than 6 feet above the lower level, or if that's working on slower, steep roofs, those employees weren't protected by fall protection. Now, that fall protection could be a guardrail, it could be a safety net system, a fall arrest system, but it's not there. Now, for low slope roofing, there's a few other caveats that can be used, but I don't want to get into those specifics today. So it's important. 6 or more feet above the ground level in construction, need to have a fall protection system. In general industry, it's 4 feet. So if you think something doesn't apply to you because, oh, it's not a construction activity, well, general industry requirement is 4 feet, so it's more restrictive. Holes are another problem. In the construction industry, a hole is defined as anything that's 2 inches or more in its least dimension. So Basically, any opening more than 2 inches by 2 inches, that's 6 feet or more above a lower level, must be covered and marked or provided with a guardrail, or employees have to use fall protection. So if you have a 2 by 2 inch hole on a construction site that you're not going to cover or surround with a guardrail, anybody that's an employee that's close to that hole needs to wear a fall arrest system. Not practical. That's just the way the law is written. This includes skylights. Skylights are considered a hole because most covers on skylights are not, and I repeat, are not capable of supporting the weight of a person if they sit or fall onto it. And we do occasionally have claims from that. So if you have a hole, if it's a small hole, one of the easiest things to do is cover it with plywood, make sure the hole is marked as a hole, and make sure whatever you cover it with is strong enough to hold a person if they were to sit or fall on it. We had a claim of an employee that sat on a hole that was covered with plywood, except it was really thin plywood that used, and he fell through the hole 24 feet, I believe it was, to a hard concrete surface below. And while he lived, he's not going to be the same after that occurred. So you need to make sure that holes are addressed on construction sites. Scaffolding, 1926 451, 3,000 citations issued for scaffolding. Scaffolding is used commonly in the construction industry. We also see scaffolding used in general industry. One thing that people don't realize is that scissor lifts, those are lifts that go up and down horizontally, they don't boom out, are considered a form of scaffolding. They're not really a piece of mobile equipment under OSHA's regulations. And so scissor lifts are also an issue. You need to realize that if an employee is more than 10 feet above a lower level, yes, OSHA mixes up at what level you need, at what height you need to have fall protection, because it's not required to have fall protection on a ladder. If you're 28 feet up in the air, you can be 9 feet in the air on scaffolding and not have to have fall protection, even though it's greater than the 6 feet required for other types of fall protection. It's OSHA. Don't want to make it too consistent. But OSHA says if you're more than 10 feet off the ground on scaffolding, you need to have fall protection. Most of the time, that's going to be guardrail. Most scaffolding is going to be protected by guardrail, but the standard covers a lot of different types of scaffolding, such as suspension scaffolding, boatswain's chairs, those types of things. So it's important to realize that guardrails aren't always appropriate for scaffolding. Thus, I can't focus on that. Next part is that scaffolding often is not provided with access. Once you have a platform that's more than 2 feet above an access point, you need to provide a ladder or stairs, hook-on ladder, scaffolding stairway, or some other means of access. What you see in the illustration here is a frame scaffold. And if that ladder wasn't attached to the end of that frame scaffold, a lot of people assume you can just climb up those handholds, or what look to be handholds, on the end of those frames. And that's not permitted. Those are not designed to be a ladder access. Even more traditional frame scaffolding that you might get at your local hardware store, they have horizontal rungs, but those are not ladders. They do not meet the requirements of ladders. The spacing's too great, and there's other characteristics you need to provide. Generally, there's a few scaffolds that have built-in ladders, but not a lot. But you need to provide a hook-on ladder, an exterior secured ladder to get onto that scaffold platform if it's more than 2 feet from a lower level. The next thing is when you have a work platform level, it needs to be fully planked. You can't have holes and gaps in it. The basis of support is another issue. You need to make sure that the scaffold poles, legs, and frames bear on a firm base. Too often these bases are just set right in the mud or on a base that's not strong enough to support the scaffold, and the scaffold simply sinks into the ground, potentially causing it to tip or fall. And so again, it's an easy one for OSHA to look at. If they can see that the scaffold's going out of level, if they see that the leg is sinking into the support material, it's an easy citation to give. And last but not least, you need to make sure that when you have guardrails on scaffolding, even scissor lifts, you need to make sure the guardrails are appropriate and that they meet the guardrail requirements for height, strength, and installation. And so you need to just be aware of that. And if you see scaffolding, people on a scaffold, especially more than 10 feet up, would encourage you more than 6 feet up, 6 feet or more, that the guardrails in place were appropriate. Or if you're using a guardrail, make sure it's in place and it meets the requirements of the particular standard. 1926 1053 ladders. Again, there is a set of standards for the general industry, slightly different than the construction industry standards. But a lot of the times we're using ladders in general industry, it's because we're painting, decorating, or doing repair and maintenance activities that would be considered construction by OSHA. Number one violation. OSHA goes to a job site, they look up portable ladders, not portable ladders being used to access a roof or some other higher surface, and that ladder does not extend at least 3 feet above the landing of that upper landing. Easy to give a citation for that. Realize that for construction, if OSHA is driving by, historically, if OSHA is driving by a construction site and they see people exposed to fall hazards, whether or not the person's protected, they need to conduct an inspection. And so the construction industry gets a large majority of the inspections, and they're focused on fall hazards because OSHA sees the employees and thus they have to inspect for that. And so I don't want to say it's bias, it's just the approach OSHA utilizes, and it's what drives up the number of fall protection citations, the ladder citations, because for OSHA to get to the top of the roof, for the upper levels to look at the fall protection issues, they're going to use this ladder, and they need to make sure that ladder meets the requirements. The next thing is that OSHA finds that employees get creative and use ladders for things other than climbing, which is a violation of the law. You need to make sure that ladders are used for their designated purpose and their design purpose. I don't think it really needs much explanation, but you can't stand on the top step of a stepladder. And that's the third most common thing OSHA sees, which is scary because on most job sites, once somebody hears OSHA is there, they all start scattering. Need to make sure that ladders are only used on stable and level surfaces. I will mention that several manufacturers are beginning to make attachments to permit ladders to be set on surfaces that are not level. And OSHA says that's acceptable as long as the attachment is properly used. In other words, follow the manufacturer's instructions if you're going to use one of the ladder attachments. And I realize I missed something here, the fourth most common reason for a ladder citation, and that's because the ladder's damaged. So you want to make sure that you're having employees inspect ladders before each use. If they find a ladder that's damaged, it's got something broken on it, have that ladder removed from service and make sure it's tagged, do not use, or some other similar language. That way OSHA recognizes, oh, somebody's inspected that ladder and it's just hanging on a wall or hanging on a truck to be used, when in essence, no, it was put on the wall or it was put on the truck not to be used. So it's important that it be tagged, because if OSHA sees a ladder that's not tagged and it's damaged, you get a citation, and that would be about a $7,000 citation today. With inflation, it's probably $130 or something. So the most common citation was for fall protection. So OSHA investigates the fall protection issues, and then they realize, oh, what do you know? The employee wasn't trained. And so fall protection training gets to become the third most common citation given in the construction industry, with over 2,000 citations given last year. The most common issues here are that when you have an employee exposed to a fall hazard in the construction industry, so when you have an employee exposed to a fall potential of 6 feet or greater above a lower level, they need to be trained. The training needs to be consistent with their exposures and responsibilities. So if you have an employee that's responsible for setting up and using a horizontal lifeline, they need much more training than an employee who's only responsible for the operation of a guardrail system. So it's not that everybody should go through the same course, nor would we want everybody to go through the same course. We just need to recognize that they need to be trained, and the training needs to be consistent with what they're going to be doing. At the end of the training process, so OSHA is finding that people were trained, but they just were finding that there wasn't proper documentation in accordance with OSHA's written certification record requirements. So you need to make sure that there's proper documentation as established in the OSHA regulation. Getting back to that question about qualified, OSHA then finds that training isn't always provided by a qualified, competent person, and both the word qualified and competent are used in fall protection. Where qualified and competent, both those words, I do not believe are used in the forklift standard. Only qualified is used in the forklift standard. I could be wrong on that. I get confused. Have to look it up. But anyway, back to that question about what is a qualified person. A qualified person is someone who has the training and experience necessary to do the job and resolve problems related to the job where OSHA defines a competent person as a person that can identify and take steps to eliminate hazards. So one of them has the knowledge and experience and can fix problems, but the other one actually has the responsibility and has the authority to fix the problems themselves. So when it comes to forklift training, you need a qualified person. So you need someone who has the training experience necessary to provide training on the proper operation of a powered industrial truck. Here's the kicker for both fall protection, confined space, excavations, powered industrial truck trainers, is that the employer needs to decide what the specific qualifications are needed for their particular place of employment. For the question about forklifts, for the protection about fall protection, I'd look at the extent of the exposure. How many different types of forklifts do you have? How many different types of fall protection situations do you have? What do employees need to know? What's the depth of the training? If you have one forklift you don't use a lot, and you have a person that's competent, has been trained, they have some education, and it doesn't need to be formal, it doesn't need to be through a third party. As an organization, you may say they're qualified. Now, I worked in a facility where we had 99 forklifts. Why we didn't have 100 was always a joke in our facility because we had no idea why we didn't have 100 even, but we had 99. And so the person that was responsible for forklift training in that organization was a person that had used forklifts extensively in their career. We had sent them out to a third-party organization for training because we realized the qualifications that that person needed were probably different because we also had a huge variety of types of forklifts in our facility. We want to make sure they were truly up to speed on all the aspects of the types of forklifts, the safe operation of all the types of the forklifts. We want to make sure they could do the evaluations for all the types of forklifts. And so it's up to each employer to determine what is qualified. The kicker to this is you have somebody that you designate as qualified. We'll talk about in respect to fall protection training here. That person gives training to the employees. The employees go up to a job site. They don't install the fall protection system properly. OSHA says, were you trained? Yes. They go talk to the trainer. What did you train them on? They find a deficiency in the training, and then they ask the trainer, well, what makes you qualified? And the employee goes, because my boss told me I am. Or the employee says, I didn't know I was qualified. I was just told I had to give the training. And then the employer can't show that they did any due diligence to prove that the employee was qualified to be a trainer. And the fact that the employee didn't train properly hints to OSHA. I don't want to say it implies to OSHA, but it hints to OSHA that the person wasn't qualified. And so it's a double-edged sword. So as an employer, figure out what you want, what qualities you're looking for in a qualified person, document as to why the person's qualified, and then you call them qualified. And there's really nothing opposed to that. When it comes to excavation, the construction industry, I wouldn't just pick somebody and say, oh, you're qualified for excavations or confined space. Make sure it's a true, thoughtful process. And last but not least, when it came to fall protection training, again, this was a retraining issue. They don't require routine retraining. It just says that you must provide retraining whenever the employee retraining must be provided whenever the employer believes that an employee or employees do not have the understanding or skill needed to meet the obligations required on the standard. And retraining is also required whenever there's changes in the fall protection systems or in the workplace that render prior training obsolete. And as I said, most modern safety standards are moving this way when it comes to retraining. It's not that it's on a set schedule, it's that certain things have to occur. Whereas older standards like the bloodborne pathogen standard, the emergency evacuation standard, fire extinguisher standard, just off the top of my head, I believe all those require annual training, even though you might have provided training on it the year before. The fifth most common citation issued in the construction industry, in 2019, was personal protective equipment. And I want to make it clear that the PPE requirements in general industry really aren't much different than the PPE requirements in the construction industry. The major difference being in general industry, you have to do a hazard assessment to determine what personal protective equipment is required for jobs or job tasks. That piece isn't required in the construction industry, but otherwise the common issues should be consistent. So number one is that employers aren't making sure that employees are using the necessary eye and face protection when they're exposed to eye and face hazards, such as flying particles, molten metal acids, caustic liquids, hazardous liquid chemicals, gases, vapors, and light radiation, such as from welding, cutting, or brazing. So OSHA is saying, look, we went to a job site. They're using a saw. They're cutting wood. They're cutting brick, cutting stone, cutting concrete, steel, whatever it is. There's particles flying. They're not wearing safety glasses. Easy citation. The next part is OSHA says, look, if there's flying particles, you need to make sure they're wearing side protection, side shields. And so, that's an easy one. Flying particles, they have safety glasses on, but the safety glasses don't have side shields. Therefore, you get a citation because you can buy safety glasses without side shields. Not common, but they can be purchased. The next one is you can't allow employees with prescription glasses to wear the prescription glasses in place of safety glasses. Prescription glasses aren't rated and approved as safety glasses. Now, you can get prescription glasses that are approved safety glasses, and then you'll see that there's a marking on the lens. The manufacturer puts their mark on the lens to imply that they are lenses that meet the safety glass requirements, and only safety glass lenses can be put into frames that are also approved as safety glass frames. Safety glasses are a combined entity. It's a product, it's a function of both the frame and the lenses need to be approved. The next most common element was that OSHA was seeing that there were glasses being worn, safety glasses being worn, that did not meet the current consensus standard for safety glasses. Now, this one puzzles me a little bit because the safety standard, the consensus standard that OSHA is referencing is Z87.1, the 1998 version. So I have a hard time believing that they're finding safety glasses in 2019 that are more than 20 years old. What I think is more likely is that employees were wearing glasses, like sunglasses. They weren't prescription glasses, and they were calling them safety glasses, but that they weren't approved for that purpose. A standard pair of glasses you buy, unless they're marked specifically as safety glasses, generally don't meet the safety glasses requirement. When you go to buy safety glasses on the frame, it will be stamped Z87.1 dash and then 1998, 2013. It's going to be whatever the year of the standard that it meets. And so if you have glasses that are Z87.1 and they're less than 1998, that's a problem. I don't think it probably is, but OSHA is implying that. And lastly, you want to make sure that employees that are welding, cutting, or brazing are using the proper filter shade in their lenses. Very, very few citations for this, but OSHA did see an issue with it, and it made the top PPE violations in 2019 in the construction industry. So if you have questions, feel free to chat them now, because this podcast went about 10 minutes shorter than anticipated. Feel free to chat them now. Sometime after 2 p.m. Central Time today, feel free to give me a call if you have questions about these common violations. You can always email me. I do have a weekly podcast series, been going on for about 20 weeks now. There's the link there, so you can check out the podcast for machine guarding. Excuse me, you can check out the podcast for routine inspections of routine inspections for lockout, tagout, excuse me. The podcast covers topics ranging from general safety issues to specific OSHA compliance issues to general philosophical thoughts about workplace safety. And so feel free to enjoy that podcast. I will hang out here another 2-3 minutes looking for anybody to chat me text messages, chat messages here. Otherwise, I greatly appreciate your participation in this month's webinar, and we'll do another webinar next month. We just haven't picked the topic yet. We're still getting our schedule together for 2020. So until next month, I'm going to mute my microphone here and see if any of you chat me questions. Have a great day. I have my first chat question here, and it's 2 parts, and I'll respond to it. It says, what type of training is required for new employees for hazard communication? It's easy and hard to answer. It's easy to answer, and OSHA says, look, you need to provide the employee with training on the labeling system you have, safety data sheet, the types of hazardous chemicals are exposed to in the work environment, that you can do it by classes of physical and health hazards. You need to talk to employees how they can recognize exposures to chemicals and how they're exposed to chemicals in the workplace. And off the top of my head, those are the primary things. OSHA actually in the standard outlines those real nicely, what the requirements are for training. The second part of this question is for new employees, what's required for lockout, tagout? This gets to be a little more challenging. The reason this is more challenging is you have to look at what the employee does. Are they just an affected employee? Does that mean they actually don't need to do lockout, tagout, but machines in their area or their equipment they operate will be locked out by an authorized employee? If they're just an affected employee, the training is really simple. The training is basically, if your piece of equipment's locked out, you see a lock and a tag on it, don't operate that piece of equipment. Don't try to operate that piece of equipment. If they're an authorized employee, meaning that they're going to be locking and tagging out equipment, we have to look at what they're going to be doing. And the best example of this is when it comes to electrical safety. I can't take a residential electrician and assume that they can work on a 2800 volt electrical substation or a transformer. And a lot of employers assume that. And so you have to look at what do they need to do. And then you need to teach them the proper procedures when it comes to lockout. You need to train them on the machine specific procedures. You need to train them on the general procedures. You need to train them on your written program. You need to train them on if they're interacting with outside contractors, how do they do group lockout, if there's shift changes. So it's hard to answer from the point, I don't know what your employees are specifically doing, what they're trying to lock out, if they're authorized or affected employees. So it's a more challenging situation. If that doesn't answer your question, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. Otherwise, I'll wait here a few more minutes, maybe a minute, minute and a half. And if anybody else chats a question, I'll be more than happy to answer it. Otherwise, have a great day.